for me, like in interviews, I used as much Arabic as I could because that helped me build rapport with them. And then understanding Islam and ideology, that helped me meet them where they were. And so I would get them to relax their shoulders and say, this guy's different. He wants to, speak to me in my language. He understands my mindset. I'd say, hey, given what happened to your cousin, I can understand why you're in the mindset that you are. I got a guy inside because I've groomed him and convinced him to report on the cell from the inside. I'll know where they are. I'll know when they're procuring explosives. If they're overseas, we'll know where they're meeting and what they're doing overseas. And so I think that's the greatest challenge. It is.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Inside National Security by the National Security Academy. I'm Haley Horan, and today I am joined by Mr. Brig Barker. On behalf of the IN Network, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today about your career in the future of national security. To start off, would you mind providing the listeners with a brief overview of your background, such as how you got here, the various roles you've held, and then we can delve further into certain aspects as we continue throughout the podcast.
Sounds great. Thanks, Haley, for having me and looking forward to the conversation. So I kind of stumbled into counterterrorism, and we can go into that in more detail. But I went to college, did the ROTC thing, and then did 5 years in the Army. Got out as a young captain. Then I did a career in the FBI and started out on violent crime and working kidnappings and working bank robberies in Los Angeles. Like the movies, and had a lot of fun and worked, fugitives and different things, and worked organized crime and gangs. And then in 1998, I went over to Kenya for the Al-Qaeda embassy bombings investigation. And that was my foray into counterterrorism. So from then through the rest of my career until I retired, I was traveling back and forth mainly to Africa, and working mainly Al-Qaeda, ISIS. I ran a couple of joint terrorism task forces, embedded with the military for about 4 years. Taught at Quantico, taught counterterrorism and interrogation at Quantico at the FBI Academy. Unlike the show, it's very different. I just had a lot of fun. And so then I retired, and I've really been working as an advisor to different companies and still working counterterrorism since I retired.
No, it's a really interesting background, and I'm sure you've had a lot of different experiences across the different, departments and things like that. And I'm sure it's been an interesting shift from being involved to kind of being more that advisory level. And like you said, you've spent your career in areas such as the military, the FBI, Joint Terrorism Task Force, and so on and so forth. So how did moving between these different institutions and fields shape the way you think about counterterrorism as a field and the other facets that are associated with it?
Yeah, I think it was definitely there was evolution in that. So I kind of went in eyes wide open, saying, what is this all about? It was very on the face of it, very complex, and I kind of was drawn to that. I always love things that I like to do things I cannot ever master because I know I'll just keep learning. I'm a lifelong learner. So when I had that experience in Kenya, we were working Al Qaeda there. I was really fascinated with it. And the biggest question for me was why? Why did they do this? Not how did they do it and those kind of things, but why did they do it? And so that was kind of the impetus for me to really dive into this. So that was the beginning. And then as time went on, I realized it's way more complex than I thought it was. And so, I think that that's what's cool about counterterrorism is number one, it's never going away. The attacks will continue, unfortunately, but there will always be work for folks that want to counter this. But I started, learning things like the ideology, which, I ended up writing a book about that. We can talk about that. But I got to a point where I said, I really want to be able to interview these folks. And more importantly, I want to recruit them. And so that was a little bit of the evolution. It was like, wow, what is this? To, oh my gosh, this is way more complex, to how do they think, mindset, things like that. And then it became, how do I interview them effectively? How do I recruit them back into their cell? how do we become effective at what we call counterterrorism pressure. So I would say that was kind of sort of the evolution of this, essentially in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, I think like you said, when events like this happen, a lot of people are focused on that why. Like, why did they feel inclined to do this? What was their motivation behind it? And that's a big reason why I am studying counterterrorism and homeland security as a master's student. You know, funny enough, I had no idea what I wanted to do post grad. And as graduation was quickly approaching, I randomly took a class on counterterrorism. Um, and, that professor was kind of like, if you really enjoy it, you should probably pursue it as a master's student, possibly. And
Hmm.
that's been a whole focus for me um, as a master's student, is trying to focus on that ideology background. I've examined it through a psychological aspect, through economic aspects, and things like that. So it's been really interesting to focus on that why. And a lot of the times, what we perceive as like that preconceived notion is not necessarily why they do what they do. Um, so that's
Yeah, no, and I would tell you, number one, don't leave the field. Like, we need you. There's not that many people that stay in counterterrorism. They kind of, okay, I'm going to do it for my resume, or I want to just dip my toe into it, and then they leave. So I would just encourage you to keep going, because again, it's such a deep ocean. I would say at this point, I've been in it, I don't know how many years. I still barely understand it, so there's so much to learn, and it can become something that you become an expert as you go along. So yeah, I would encourage you just keep diving into the why.
Yeah, I think it's one of those super interesting fields of like the sense it's always just a rabbit hole per se. No matter where you go, you're going to find a different path and a different avenue to investigate. And I think a lot of the time, unfortunately, we place a lot of emphasis on, organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and things like that, but we kind of neglect other organizations until they kind of arise. And then it's like, oh, yeah, I kind of forgot to look into like what you guys are doing and where you might be based and what your motivations are. And so I think that's a big reason why I focused on different regions, not per se the Middle East, because that's the key focus for everybody normally. And looked at a different region like, Latin America or even North Africa and things like that. So um, to go off of that, a lot of your work that you did was overseas. You mentioned you had time in Europe and you were in Kenya for a lot of your time when you were doing this work. So, based on those experiences, how did the work in those environments reveal things that domestic counterterrorism might not reveal?
Yeah, I think that was the cool part of it for me was, again, going back to 98. We landed in Nairobi. I've never been to Africa before. Lived overseas for 5 years before that. I go to Africa, I land, and I see an acacia tree, the kind of the infamous, tree for Africa. And it was early morning, and it was just kind of foggy. And I was like, okay, this is amazing. Now I get to go see what this terrorism thing is all about. And so I think mixing those together really made it interesting for me. So, you're talking about different countries, that's the interesting thing. I worked bank robberies for a little while. Some FBI agents work it their whole career, and good on them, and we need that. But for me, I was like, it's my training agent used to say when I was working bank robberies, there's only so many variations to this. With counterterrorism, there's 1,000 plus variations. So if you're working Africa, Al-Qaeda, it's very different from working Mali, ISIS, or Hezbollah in Latin America. You've got all these different facets, but I think that the ideology is kind of the thread that holds a lot of it together, based on who you're working or who you're interviewing and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think that all the different countries and the different layers to it just make it very interesting to work long term.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how you said that, your own personal experience of stepping off the plane, seeing the infamous tree, and then being like, oh, I'm here to work on a counterterrorism initiative. I think that's really an interesting, never would have thought of that, of like, oh, you guys are still human too. Like you're thinking of, oh, how is this experience going to shape how I perceive what I'm studying or what I'm actively fighting against, um, or fighting for, in the initiative of counterterrorism. So, how do you see threats from regions like Africa being different, and even, I guess you could say, neglected compared to other regions, and what areas should be given more focus going forward?
Yeah, I mean, we have to, at the policy level, focus with priorities, right? So we've got to prioritize groups, we've got to prioritize threats and regions and things like that. Um, you know, as I kind of look at, one over the world right now, I do believe that the Sahel of Africa is our next major concern because last time I was in Africa, I was working in Togo and Ghana in West Africa. And, I was talking to people, I was doing a counterterrorism assessment. And I said, do you have any jihadist threats here? And they said, no, we have none in the entire country. And they didn't. And then now the axis of jihad has dropped from, if you're looking at the map, from Algeria, which was, AQIM way back when, has dropped down into the Sahel. We're talking, Niger and Mali and that band, and into West Africa, Togo, Ghana, all these places that before were kind of untouched, but I see the Sahel of Africa probably the most concerning swath of land right now because I think that's going to be the next caliphate declared by ISIS. I think that, like we had in Iraq and Mosul, they have a, caliph who leads it. They have a caliphate. It's like this utopian place to live. And they call, hijra, requirements that all Muslims should move there and live in this utopian land, led by Sharia law and governed in certain ways according to rules. And so I kind of see that part of Africa is going to be that next caliphate. So.
Do you think that, as things are taking place in Iran and in Venezuela and other regions around the world that are, of key focus right now, do you feel there's even been like an adequate response from policymakers towards this, or no?
Yeah, I think we don't do a great job at the policy level, I would say. This is, Briggs' opinion. But, I think we have to look at Iran, right? We're gathering forces, we're mustering, we're putting resources in place in the region, for whatever's to come next. And Iran has proxies, as you know. They have Hezbollah, they have Hamas, they have the rebels in Yemen, and those are folks that will do things, the Quds Force, right? And so we cannot ignore that threat. We cannot ignore the threat of Hezbollah in Latin America and what they might do. I don't, some of this is going to, the concern for me is our bases, globally. That's of course a concern. But right now we've got to focus on this, but we also have to focus on the proxies, I'm hoping that Homeland Security agencies are going to do that, but we've got to stay, focused on that while we're still tracking ISIS and Al-Qaeda is still out there, doing things. So it's a tough job to prioritize at the policy level. I mean, I think we make mistakes there regularly, but we don't admit our mistakes and shift. But yeah, we've got to be focused on these proxies right now, would be my thought.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, the word prioritize and trying to figure out which ones to go about placing emphasis on first. How, I guess, in your role or as a whole, did you go about choosing cases to prioritize? And what did you do in a situation where both were equally high in threat level? And how did you go about picking, I guess, one or over the other, or placing more emphasis on one?
Yeah, great question. I mean, as a counterterrorism agent, I had 12 cases or whatever it was. And I was, kind of defaulting to the egg timer of what's the biggest concern, what could go bad, and collapsing into the topic of radicalization. I would go out and interview these targets. And I got to a point after working this about 10 years to feel real comfortable saying this is where this guy is in the radicalization process. that was very predictable for me. Unpredictability was what's the trigger to action, right? So, but amongst my cases as an agent, I was constantly going, okay, who's going to pop off here and get a rifle and go do something bad? And then once I had, Joint Terrorism Task Force, I've got whatever 12 agents times 12 cases, it gets a little more complicated. So I started trying to do the same thing. It's like I mean, I learned so much from my own mistakes and watching other people that are very good practitioners. But in the beginning, I was like egg timer. Okay, what's gonna, who's gonna, carry out, some action against a military base or whatever it might be, the threat, looking at the risk of that. And after a number of years doing that, it became a feel for me, not a science. It became an art, because I would sit down and do file reviews with my agents and we'd go through all their cases and I could just, feel where the greatest threat was. I believe everybody has a single talent in seeing the entire battlefield in some area of their life. Like some people are super talented at the game of chess. They see the chessboard and they really have this fascinating supernatural talent to see everything that's getting ready to happen. Or I love hockey, right? So Wayne Gretzky, they said he was always two steps ahead of all the other players on the ice. He could see the trajectory of where the puck was going. I'll say, I felt that way in counterterrorism. Like I could look at a lot of cases and just had a feel like this is the one we need to be focused on. So I don't care about the matrix or the PowerPoint presentation from executives on. We need to focus on this because based on our alphanumeric coding, this is the greatest threat. I learned that it really became kind of a feel for me. So I started relying on that.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how it evolved from, a methodology to kind of like a feeling type of avenue in response to what was going on in the world. Um, I don't know if this is a silly question per se, but you know, with all the various regions that we have around the world, um, how did you manage focusing on all of them? And also kind of going through that same process? Was it just, as you said, going through the cases and evaluating everything that was in front of you? Or, did you kind of have a region yourself that you were more focused on? Just like to hear more about that.
Yeah. So one thing I did running JTTFs is I would go on interviews, and so and only if I was invited, But I did get invited a lot, and so we'd have certain targets, and an agent would say, "Hey, can you come out with me and interview this guy? He's from Yemen. Here's the background, whatever it is." So that helped me kind of take in, more viscerally is this guy a threat? It was the same in interrogations for me. I interviewed 500 plus, jihadists in my career. And in the beginning, it was a methodology, right? In the beginning, I was failing constantly. I was using criminal interview techniques as an overlay to interview a jihadist. And I learned when they were walking out of the room, like I failed again, I failed again. And so started figuring out, okay, I need something else. And I just started kind of creating what worked for me. And I started finding some successes. And so anyways, with JTTFs, I would go out, interview, some of these targets, and that helped me kind of figure out. So we got a guy from Yemen, we've got this concern coming out of Pakistan, whatever it might be. Again, it was more of a feel. I was figuring out, what I felt like, and a lot of it was taken in from the case agent. But I was also concerned with the potential for action, right? Some guys are going to be radicalized in their mind their whole life and they'll never do anything, right? So again, going back to radicalization, it was always unpredictable what puts them on that road. It could be a number of factors, grievances, their cousin got killed in Palestine, whatever it is, and all of a sudden they started down that road. That road to me, and I used to teach on that road of radicalization for hours, was very predictable, but the unpredictability was the trigger to action. So I was always looking at, if a guy starts talking about, I'm going to do something, of course, that's a factor. But then also, if we were looking at overseas targets, how expeditionary are they? And they're going to come to the U.S. So I look at Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and I think very, very rarely are they going to come to the U.S. and do something. They're interested in kind of, near-term targets. So.
Yeah, no, I think like you said, it's very different, when you were to interview a jihad compared to um a criminal like you had the experience of doing in LA. And so going off of that, what did you find to be the hardest part during your time with the Joint Terrorism Task Force and as a supervisory special agent? Like, was it necessarily an interview process, or were there other things that kind of led to difficulties, and how do they vary across agencies?
Yeah, great question again. I think one of the greatest challenges is always the executive pressure above you. It's again a lot of, especially if they don't understand what you're doing, what the threat is, and that kind of thing. That's always there in any agency. Doesn't matter. I was talking with someone last night about this. But I think that the greatest challenge in counterterrorism is recruiting. It's like we have so much fraud, waste, and abuse in counterterrorism. It's sad. Like we put out all these bulletins and briefings and papers and these kind of things saying, "Hey, look for a guy with bulky clothing." Well, heck, okay, that gets me nowhere. What we need is we've got to understand the ideology of the jihadist. That helps me, get them to be able to build rapport with them in an interview room. And then ultimately, what I want to do is I want to recruit them back into their cell, like I mentioned before. If I can do that, man, it's efficient. If I got a guy inside because I've convinced him, I've groomed him and convinced him to report on the cell from the inside. I'll know where they are. I'll know when they're procuring explosives. If they're overseas, we'll know where they're meeting and what they're doing overseas. And so I think that's the greatest challenge. It is really hard. And it's almost like, I don't want to do it. It's so hard. But otherwise, we're playing whack-a-mole. We did that for 20 years in the global war on terrorism. And there's super benefit in doing some of that. But if we can recruit them, we can figure out where 100 of them are gathered, as opposed to just dealing with onesies and twosies.
Yeah, no, I think like you said, each individual has their own motivation. It's not necessarily one set motivation that leads them to do what they do. And, there's also the emphasis from the higher ups in their organization. What are they wanting to do? And that's, I think, what makes counterterrorism and just terrorism as a whole so complex and so unique compared to other fields. Like, you can always at some point find a connection somewhere, but this one, there are so many dots that you're connecting at one point, and as you connect them, they unleash other dots that you didn't think of before either. So I think that's what makes it so interesting to study, is that you never really have that set understanding of why one person does what they do, why one organization does what they do. So I find that to be extremely interesting. And hopefully, maybe
Yeah,
one day we can find those dots and they can all connect at one point. But um,
it's the challenge of it, the hunt of it that's fun. And I used to have butcher paper, way back when, and we would chart out in a cell who's who. And, it's kind of to your point, like, well, this guy's the financier guy, and here's the computer tech guy, here's the ideologue, and here's just some guys that are conflicted, but they're still in the cell. And then you look at that and you say, who are we going to try to recruit? Who's vulnerable? Who's again conflicted, and maybe we can bring them over to our side. And there's, this guy's got a warrant for his arrest, and then this one's on parole. And so it's this whole chessboard, of trying to figure it out. I would say, that, interviewing Al-Qaeda and ISIS guys and homegrown violent extremist guys, their motivation based on ideology is very predictable. It's very known. But to figure out that motivation, you've got to build rapport with them in an interview room. I think that's kind of step one. For me, I got to the point where I said, I got to build rapport with this guy. But once I've got rapport, then things again are getting more efficient, and then I used to ask about 10 questions that were very almost controversial. What's your opinion about Palestine? And then, as an interrogator, you have to let there be silence. You can't go in and bail them out. You have to let them answer. And then I would use their answers to start focusing on that continuum of radicalization and trying to figure out where they were. But once I built rapport, I can say they just wanted to talk about religion. That once I had true rapport with a jihadist, didn't matter how sold out he was, he just wanted to talk about Islam and the Antichrist and eschatology and where the final war was going to be in the world against the infidels and things like that. So that is known, but it takes a while to kind of get there.
Yeah, I liked the point that you made of trying to find that person. I think a lot of the times we forget that it's not just one person trying to commit the act. They do have financiers and they have people that are working on computer programs and other things like that for them. And I think it brings up the fact of, when they were trying to find Osama bin Laden and they used the messenger and things like that. And um, just the simple things that you don't necessarily think of oftentimes really help, launch you into figuring out how to get in with the network and how to um, find that one person that can bring you that information that you so desperately need in order to prevent, large scale attacks and so on and so forth. Kind of shifting gears a little bit, you mentioned your book, The Dark Trajectory of Jihad. So I would love to know kind of what the book is about and what inspired you to write it.
Yeah, so I've spoken at conferences. I've really kind of taught on this since 2002. Part-time while I was in the FBI, I just went and taught constantly, taught at the FBI, taught at the CIA, taught military folks. And, one day after a conference, this cop came up to me. He's like, where is this written down? you know, like the stuff I teach is very unique. It is not, it's talk about ideology. Like I go in deep, for 2 weeks straight. And so I said, I've got to put this down somewhere. So I started typing, and that was really what caused me to write the book. And so um, I wanted to get in there this ideology because I would proffer at this point. We still don't understand this enemy. Everyone's like, oh, you gotta Sun Tzu. You have to understand know the enemy. And I would say we don't understand this jihadist enemy. We really don't. Military, law enforcement, citizens, we just don't. And so that was kind of the goal is to put something in there. And I used vignettes of different things I've done overseas mainly. Um, and then it had to go through pre-publication review by attorneys at the FBI, which took 6 months or so. They didn't really want to publish it, and so I had to change, names and things like that. But eventually, I just wanted to get it out so that ideology was understood.
Wow, that's great. No, it really caught my eye when I was looking through your profile. And I look forward to reading it one day. Kind of going off of that as well, you mentioned the different experiences that you've had and the roles that you've had. Um, so looking back across those roles, what lessons have you learned and which ones primarily stuck with you over time?
Um, I think that the biggest lesson I've learned, I kind of look at this as war fighting in a way. We're fighting against an enemy that wants to kill us. Like that, if you look at the New Orleans attacker a year ago, right? That guy wants to kill anybody who doesn't believe in his, what I call circle of micro theology, right? And so it's in a way counterterrorism, given the word counter. We're going against terrorists, right? We're fighting against terrorists, whatever that looks like, wherever that is taking place. And so one thing that I learned was I cannot operate at his pace. I need to operate at my pace. And so as I'm looking at a threat, whether it's a cell or an individual, I need to slow down. That was the greatest lesson I learned is I need to slow down. I need to breathe slower than my enemy. Because if I'm doing that, if I'm I just am pulling in a lot more of my peripheral vision on what this guy's doing. If I'm trying to stay up with him and he's running and gunning and going and planning and procuring and doing all these things, I'm going at his pace. What I need to do is slow down and just take in what is he doing, who else is he involved with, is he using AI, crypto, is he moving money, is he involved in any fraudulent activity that I can leverage against him. So just kind of that, let's slow down and let's just take all this in. And then as he moves, we evaluate his movement, and this again goes to that feel. To me, it became such an art, not a science. I think if you've never worked this, you try to track them at their pace and you're trying to beat them to the end. It's kind of that, before they attack, I've got to do something. But if you just kind of slow down, terrorism, look at Al-Qaeda, years in the planning for 9/11, right? They take years. ISIS is much more impulsive. I see ISIS as a gang as opposed to like a terrorist organization, even though they're barbaric and they have an ideology that's almost the same as Al Qaeda. They're sloppy, and they're planning and things like that. Al Qaeda is long term. They're more like a mob, like the mobster family. It's like we're going to take our time. We're going to do this right. We're going to be quiet, those kind of things. So, but I would say the lesson I learned was I'm just going to slow down, and we'll still beat them.
Yeah, I think, it's another preconceived notion is that you need to get ahead, you need to be at their pace, you need to ensure that the attack is prevented. But, if you're trying to keep up with them, you're missing a lot of those, I guess you could say, Easter eggs that they're leaving behind that really
Yeah.
help you figure out who they're meeting with and things like that. And so I think that's a really good lesson, for even individuals who haven't even joined the field, is understanding that before they even get started, is that it's not a marathon to catch up to them. It's rather a planning, and it's practice and getting to just understand those things that they're trying to do. Um,
Yeah.
and so to go off of that as well, like for students who are either studying it currently or are interested in studying counterterrorism, what skills or experiences do you feel matter most as they begin their career?
I think teachability is one of the most important things that you can do walking into this. I remember on one of my when I was a case agent on a JTTF, we got a task force officer we call TFOs, which are local law enforcement, he's a detective, and he shows up the first day, and I had been through six immersion Arabic schools. I love Arabic. It's one of I am still fascinated by it. I'm very rusty, but I got to the point where I was fluent. And first day I was talking to him, and he says, "I want you to teach me Arabic," and I was like,